Ever wonder what's going through a surgeon's mind beyond, the medical stuff?
Yeah, like what keeps them up at night?
Exactly. So today's deep dive is all about that. We're going behind the scenes of a podcast made for surgeons. It's fascinating. Really gives you a peek into their world, the ethical dilemmas they face.
Oh, wow. It's like we're getting a rare glimpse into these like high pressure decisions.
Right. And it all starts with something you always hear in medicine, the four pillars of medical ethics. Autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice.
Okay, the foundational principles. And they sound so simple on paper, right? Respect patient choice, do what's best for them, do no harm, be fair.
Sounds like a good starting point.
It does, but then you get into the operating room and suddenly those principles are bumping up against, well, the realities of surgery.
It's where the rubber meets the road, as they say. Did the podcast give any concrete examples, like how these principles actually play out?
Oh, they did. One that really got me thinking was about this idea of do no harm. Imagine a patient who needs a risky procedure. It's a long shot, might even mean more harm in the short term, but it's their only hope.
Wow. So how do you balance that? Giving someone a chance, even a slim one, versus potentially causing more suffering.
That's the million-dollar question,
Yeah.
right? And it forces these surgeons to think beyond just the technical stuff. It's about the patient's values, their wishes, what a good outcome means for them.
Which is why informed consent is so important.
Huge. And I don't just mean getting a signature on a form.
Right. It's going to be more than just a formality.
Exactly. It's about making sure the patient truly understands the risks, the benefits, what other options there are. But even that can be tricky. Medical jargon, cultural differences.
And you don't want to overwhelm someone right before surgery.
Exactly. But then again, you can't just gloss over the important stuff either. They actually made a point in the podcast about nonverbal cues.
Oh, interesting. Like what?
So a patient might be nodding along, but their body language tells a different story. Or maybe they're scared to ask what they think is a stupid question. Surgeons have to be really perceptive.
It makes you think about all those times you hesitated to ask your doctor something because you don't want to sound silly.
Right. It's that human element that makes these ethical considerations so tricky. The best surgeons, they create this environment where patients feel safe asking anything.
Empowering them to be a part of their own care. So we've talked about the main principles, informed consent. What other ethical challenges came up?
Well, they went deep on some tough scenarios. What happens when a surgeon's personal beliefs clash with what the patient wants? How do teams handle disagreements, especially in the middle of a surgery?
Oh, wow. And then there's end-of-life care, which is a whole other...
Heavy stuff.
It really makes you think. It's one thing to read about ethics in a textbook, but applying them in those high-pressure moments, that's got to be intense.
It is. And that's where a strong surgical team becomes so important. The podcast really emphasized how teams work through disagreements, especially when it comes to these ethical questions.
Yeah, imagine the pressure cooker of the OR. It's literally life or death, and you've got this whole teams, surgeons, nurses, anesthesiologists, all these highly skilled people, and they have to be on the same page.
Right. And you're right. It's not just the surgeon making these calls. So how do they make sure everyone's voice is heard? Especially when every second counts.
That's what I found so fascinating. They talked about how critical it is to have that open communication, even when things get tense.
So it's like creating a space where everyone feels safe speaking up.
Exactly, because even the most experienced surgeon might miss something, or someone might have a different perspective. The podcast really emphasized that teamwork aspect.
Makes you think about all those medical dramas on TV where it's always the lone genius surgeon making the big calls.
Right, but in reality, it's way more nuanced. It's about acknowledging that everyone on that team has something valuable to contribute. It's that whole two heads are better than one idea, but with much higher stakes. Speaking of different perspectives, the podcast also touched on cultural competency in surgery. What did they have to say about that?
Oh, that's a big one. They were saying how surgeons need to be aware of different cultural beliefs about medical decisions, even how people experience pain. It can really impact the whole patient experience.
That makes sense. It's not just about the technical stuff. It's about understanding the person on the operating table.
Exactly. One example they gave was how some cultures might be hesitant to question the doctor, or they might express pain differently.
It's about meeting the patient where they're at, respecting their background, their beliefs.
Absolutely. And that takes a lot of active listening, asking the right questions.
And being sensitive to those nonverbal cues we talked about earlier.
Right, exactly. It all ties together.
It's interesting because we often focus on the success stories in surgery, But this podcast didn't shy away from the tough stuff, like surgical errors.
Yeah, that was a really powerful part of the discussion. They talked about how important it is to be transparent when those errors occur.
Which can't be easy. I mean, surgeons are human, they make mistakes, but admitting that.
It's huge. And they were saying how that honesty is crucial for maintaining trust with patients.
And for learning from those mistakes, right?
Exactly. They emphasized how important it is to have a culture of continuous improvement, not just blaming someone when something goes wrong.
So it's about moving away from that culture of blame and towards a culture of learning.
Right, because ultimately it's about improving patient safety.
And speaking of improvement, the podcast also touched on innovation in surgery, new technologies, new techniques. It seems like things are constantly evolving.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing how fast things are moving. But they made a good point about balancing that innovation with patient safety.
Because just because something is new and shiny doesn't mean it's always the best approach.
Right. Right. They talked about the importance of rigorous testing, clinical trials, making sure these new technologies are actually effective and safe before they're widely used.
It's about making those informed decisions, not just jumping on the bandwagon of every new advancement.
Exactly. It's about being cautious, but also being open to new possibilities.
Finding that balance. You know, one thing that really struck me was this idea of reflection. The podcast emphasized how vital it is for surgeons to really reflect on their experiences, good and bad.
Oh yeah, that was a big takeaway for me too. They talked about how reflecting on their decisions, especially those tough ones, helps them grow as surgeons.
It's like that saying, experience is the best teacher, but you have to actually take the time to process those experiences, to learn from them.
Right, and I think that's especially important in a field like surgery where the stakes are so high.
You're dealing with people's lives, it's bound to stay with you.
And it's not just about learning from mistakes, it's also about celebrating successes, acknowledging what went well.
And maybe even finding a way to process those emotionally challenging cases.
Exactly. It's about taking care of their own mental well-being too.
You know, we've covered so much ground here. From those foundational principles of medical ethics to the really human aspects of surgery, like teamwork, cultural sensitivity, dealing with errors. It's a lot to unpack. And to think this was just a glimpse into one podcast episode aimed at surgeons makes you realize how much goes on that we never even hear about.
It's like a whole other world, right? I mean, you see those medical shows on TV, but this was different, much more real.
Definitely. And you know what really hit home for me? They talked about how important it is for surgeons to have a good support system.
Oh, yeah. To talk about those tough cases, those difficult decisions.
Because even when a surgery goes well, those experiences can stay with you.
Especially when you're dealing with life and death situations.
It's got to weigh on you. And I think that's where that idea of reflection comes in, not just to learn and improve, but also just to process everything.
To make sense of it all. And the podcast actually ended with a question, or really thought-provoking one, about this very idea.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. It really stuck with me. They asked, given the weight of their decisions, how do surgeons reconcile themselves with that responsibility?
Wow. It's a heavy question. And it's not just surgeons, right? I mean, anyone who makes big decisions where the stakes are high.
Teachers, parents, CEOs.
Yeah.
We all face those moments where our choices have a real impact.
It's a very human thing, isn't it? To grapple with those decisions, the potential consequences.
And that's what I loved about this deep dive. It wasn't just about the technical stuff, the rules of medical ethics. It was about the human side of surgery.
The emotions, the challenges, the triumphs. It's a reminder that even the most brilliant surgeons, they're still human.
And I think we often forget that. We put them on a pedestal, expect perfection. But they're just like us, trying to do their best in a really demanding field.
With people's lives in their hands, it's a lot of pressure.
It is. But after listening to this podcast, I have even more respect for surgeons. They're not just skilled with a scalpel, they're navigating these complex ethical dilemmas all the time.
And they're doing it while trying to stay human, to connect with their patients.
It's a powerful reminder that there's always more to the story than meets the eye, no matter what the profession is.
That's so true. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. Think about a time you faced a really tough decision. How did you deal with it? Did you talk it over with someone? Did it change you? Those are the questions that stay with us long after the episode's over.
Keep those wheels turning, and we'll be back next time with another deep dive. Thanks for listening.